Dr. Jamal Wakim, since the beginning of the war in Syria, Israeli occupation forces have conducted hundreds of airstrikes against Syria. Sometimes they call it surgical strikes. Sometimes they say there is an Iranian threat. And in other times, they say that Syria is preparing some sort of popular resistance in order to liberate or capture the occupied Golan Heights. Now, a few hours ago, the Israeli occupation forces also conducted three airstrikes against Syria. They didn't give any explanation. In what context do you put these limited strikes by Israel, knowing that these strikes are not achieving strategic goals for Israel?
I believe that these strikes are meant to test Syrian defenses on one hand, and to test the political stances of various powers on the other hand, including the Russians, the Iranians, and of course the Lebanese resistance that is operating on Syrian territory for the time being. So all these tests are part of an attempt from the side of the Israelis and the United States to see to what extent they could be successful if they wage war against Syria and against Hezbollah as part of their grand strategy to neutralize Syria, Hezbollah, and of course Iran and Russia, because the attempt of the United States is to block any access by Russia and by Iran to the East Mediterranean, and to redraw the geopolitical map of the region, mainly the Near East, in order to fit Israeli interests and to integrate the region into the Israeli sphere of influence.
Mhm.
So far, all these tests, all these air raids were trying to see to what extent the Syrian defenses could be able to ward off the threats, to what extent the Russians and the Iranians could be neutralized in any strike against Syria, and to what extent the Israelis could escalate tension without being subject to major retaliation from the side of the Syrians or from Hezbollah.
Dr. Jamal, from what you said, what I have sensed is that there could be a war between Syria and Israel, or Israel with other regional players. So if you're saying that they are testing the capabilities of the Syrian army air defenses and their capabilities of thwarting Israeli airstrikes, that means Israel might be planning for future wars in the region.
Well, war was always a part of the agenda of Israel for the past 7 decades, since the establishment of the State of Israel on Palestinian soil. Because Israel by itself is a tool by Western powers that was set on Arab territory in order to subjugate Arab states and forbid it from having an independent future and an independent destiny. So we see since 1949 that all wars waged by the State of Israel were part of a greater agenda to subjugate the region. In the past 4 decades, since the withdrawal of Egypt from the Arab-Israeli struggle, Israel have focused all its efforts against Syria, being the second major power fighting Israel and confronting Israeli hegemony. So war was always existent. It was always the state of affairs between the Syria on one hand and Israel on the other hand, especially that they compete over the same sphere of influence, geopolitical sphere, which is Greater Syria. So in the past few decades, Lebanon served as an arena for a war by proxy between these two states. So in 1982, for example, Syria was part of the Israeli aggression against Lebanon, in the sense that it was subject to Israeli aggression assault. in 1993, 1996, in 2000 and 2006. All these wars were not only directed against Lebanon, but were also directed against
Mhm.
Syria. Lately, with the Syrian crisis, which was also an extension to this struggle between the two states, especially that we know that many opposition forces are supported by Israel and by the United States. When we saw that whenever these armed militants or Islamic groups were not capable of fighting the Syrian army,
Mhm.
this is where Israel intervened in order to attack certain Syrian outposts or positions in order to redraw the equilibrium between these Islamists or radical Islamists and the Syrian Arab army.
Dr. Wakim, Dr. Wakim,
In the past,
I'm quite sure
yeah.
that tonight the pro-war, these so-called liberal activists will frame you as a conspiracy theory because you said what's happening in Syria from this crisis, that it's an extension of the conflict with Israel. But let me ask you this question, Dr. Wakim, despite these allegations that you might receive. Syria, after 8 years of war in Syria, on its soil, I was reading an article for Robert Fisk, and he says that the Syrian army could be the best trained and the best equipped army after the war in the region, because it has 8 years of experience on all sorts of equipments and experience in two kinds of warfare, which is a traditional warfare and guerrilla warfare. Do you think
Yeah.
Israel could miscalculate and underestimate the strength of the Syrian army? And in the next few months, we know in the region there is this tension now between Iran and the United States, and now between Syria and Israel. Do you think that Israel could go in this adventure to thwart the growing power of Syria in the future?
Well, first, I would like to say that I am a scholar. I try to be objective in my approach, so I don't care if I get framed by anyone for my ideas. So I might be, let's say, I try to read facts, analyze facts, and draw conclusions. And if anybody doesn't like it, it's his problem. Well, and I'm not that enthusiastic to go to the West, so they can ban me from having any visa. It would be, I would never apply for a visa, by the way.
Mhm.
So the problem is solved. But regarding the attempt by Israel to wage war against Syria, let's not. I'm not a military expert, so with regards to the Syrian capabilities, of course, I read reports, and I believe that the experience of the Syrian army, especially in the new type of warfare. The postmodern warfare, which is based on guerrilla warfare, on mobile, let's say, armed
Mhm.
forces. I believe that they have gained experience, but we need not underestimate the capabilities of the Israeli army. On the other hand, especially in terms of technology and high tech and modern warfare. But at the same time, these capabilities of Syria and, of course, of its allies, especially that in any future war, Syria would not be alone in this war. The Israelis should calculate the possible losses that they could injure, and to what extent they could sustain these losses and these, let's say, casualties that they could injure. This is one question, and this is one of the reasons why Israel so far has been reluctant to wage a major war. It has been trying to test these defenses, try to test, of course, reactions, the political sphere, etc. Uh, so war was always on the agenda. To what extent they could be waging a war right now, we need to analyze the political situation. In spite of the fact that the Americans have mobilized all that they could do in support of Israel and in support of this deal of the century
Mhm.
regarding the Palestinian cause. Most Arab states, for example, are supportive to this deal under American pressure. Of course, Western powers, and we see, on the other hand, an opposition led by Palestinian resistant groups, Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran. So, in spite of this, we see that Netanyahu was not able to form a government,
Mhm.
a coalition government, and he called for another election. It's the first time in the history of the state of Israel since its establishment. So now they are preparing for another election in the next few weeks. And we need not forget that Donald Trump himself is preparing for his presidential elections in next autumn. So, to what extent this political atmosphere could uh, allow or prepare for a major war in the region?
Mhm.
Um, I believe that this undermines the possibility of a major war, but at the same time, the Americans and the Israelis and their allies in the region are losing time. And when they lose time, when a certain, let's say, party loses time or feels that it's losing time, it might revert to irrational actions, uncalculated actions, and this might increase the possibility of a major war, especially that the Americans need to resolve the situation in the region to their favor prior to other powers, mainly Eurasian powers like Russia, China, alongside Iran, could magnify their capabilities, increase their power, and increase their alliances all over the world. We are moving towards, let's say, um, a century where Western hegemony in the world would fade out. Um, we've been living in the what we call the Colombian era for the past 5 centuries, when the economic hub of the world had moved from the Indian Ocean towards the Atlantic. And now we are with the rise of Eurasian powers, we are witnessing a shift of the economic hub from the North Atlantic back to the Indian Ocean. And with this, with this fact, Western Europe and the United States, or Western powers in general, will be marginalized in global affairs. And this is something that Western geopolitical thinkers are talking about. This means that time is not running in favor of the United States and Israel. And if they couldn't resolve the situation to their favor in the next few months, we might be witnessing a status quo for the next 1.5 years until a new, I'd say,
Elections.
administration
Mhm.
gets formed in the United States. Either Donald Trump wins a second term, or a new president would be elected. But by this time, China would become the major economic power in the world. Russia would be capable of strengthening its position in its neighborhood, direct neighborhood, alongside Iran, and this would instigate other powers to detach themselves from American hegemony, like India, Brazil, South Africa, and other powers. Of course, many people argue that many powers have, let's say, economic links to the American oligarchy.
Mhm.
However, I believe that the world system, the global system, is moving from a unipolar system where capital is concentrated in the United States to a system where we have various capitalist, let's say, centers of power. And it would be the same oligarchy, for example, in Brazil, that is linked to the United States, that would prefer to detach itself from American hegemony and play an independent role. Same would apply to India, South Africa, Russia, China, and many other countries. Uh, because in the past 3,000 years, the international economic system have always tended towards concentration of capital, which we call globalization. So globalization is not a new trend in the world. The first globalized system was established by the Assyrians back in the first millennium BC. The second globalization was the Achaemenid Persian globalization. The third was the Arab, by the way, when the Arabs took over the Middle East, and they were able to control major trade routes or international trade routes for at least 3 or 4 centuries. And then we had the Mongol era, and lately we have witnessed, with the rise of Europe and mainly the United States, a globalized system controlled by the United States. Now, when capital is concentrated, and this is the argument of Lenin, maybe many people wouldn't like to hear this, but when he wrote his magnificent book, Imperialism, the Last Stage of Capitalism, it was almost a century ago, and it was prior to the First World War. He was arguing that we will witness war, and this war would be devastating to the capitalist world, and this would open the gate for a socialist world. Of course, in his predictions, he was not that accurate. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the socialist bloc, the United States had the opportunity to establish a unipolar system and call for globalization, where international trade would be controlled by the United States. However, in the past decade, we were witnessing a shift towards decentralization of the global economic system, with the rise of capitalist centers like Russia, China, South Africa, India, Brazil, and other countries that they were demanding their share or their cut of the global economy. And this would strip the United States from its privileged position as the controller of the global trade and global economy. And this is why the United States wants to control the crossroad of and intersection of international trade routes, mainly in the Middle East. And this explains, of course, the Syrian crisis, the Iraqi crisis, the invasion of Iraq, the invasion by the United States of Afghanistan, because this region is very important. This is where international trade routes, since the beginning of history, has joined together. And whoever controls this intersection of international trade routes would control international commerce and imposes its
Political
will and
on the word.
hegemony on other powers.
Dr. Wakim, if we go back on a local level in Syria once again, one question that I often receive on Syriana analysis is, Syria bought the S-300 system from Russia, but till the moment didn't use it. You studied the Arab-Israeli conflict and especially the Syrian-Israeli conflict. Why do you think the Syrian army is not using the S-300 yet in doing these limited airstrikes, let's say?
Well, the answer could have grassroots in the first question. If Israel is testing Syrian defenses, why the Syrians would expose all their capabilities for the time being? So they would keep some secrets for the Israelis to discover during a major war, the way, for example, Hezbollah did in 2006 when it used the Cornet anti-tank missiles in the last 2 days of the war, when the Israelis thought that they could invade Lebanese territories and reach the Litani River. This is where they were surprised by the Cornet that destroyed nearly 50 Israeli tanks of the latest models, and this had a big effect on the tide of war that was won by Hezbollah, and at the same time, it ruined the reputation of the Merkava vehicle or tank that was produced by Israeli military. And Israel also not only lost the lives of its soldiers, but also lost billions of dollars in military deals with various powers. So
And the,
I believe that not a single power would
and the
unveil
reputation
all
of these
the
tanks was
secrets and
destroyed
capabilities
globally,
that
right? And the reputation of these tanks were also destroyed globally.
yeah, definitely. And by the way, this enhanced the confidence of the Lebanese people in their defenses. I need to say that I was a kid where I was 9 years old when Israel invaded Lebanon.
In 82.
The sight of the Israeli planes, even from afar, used to cause fear and terror for us.
Mhm.
Now we feel confident up to the level of going straight to the borderline and challenging the Israeli army right there. We feel confident in our territory and we feel confident that we could retaliate. I believe that the Syrians have the same approach, which is not to unveil all the secrets and capabilities that they have and to only use it when it's only necessary.
Dr. Wakim, last question. No, in my opinion, we shouldn't expect if any future war erupts between Syria and Israel, we shouldn't expect that Russia would fully side on the side of Syria. Do you think that Russia could benefit of any future war between Syria and Israel by imposing itself as a neutral broker of peace broker between both sides, knowing that Russia has good relationship both with Syria and Israel?
Uh, well, these good relations might be on a business level, on let's say a personal level. However, it's after all about geopolitics. Russia has a geopolitical interest in having a foothold on the Eastern Mediterranean. Ever since the establishment of the Russian Empire, um, at least with the Romanov in 1613. So they have always had their eyes on the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Syrian-Russian relations date back to the 18th century, since the first Russian victory against the Ottoman army. So, in spite of the good relations that link Russia to Israel, however, I believe that on the geopolitical level, Israel is an ally of the United States and it's playing the role of the key ally of the United States in the region. This makes it an eventual enemy of Russia, especially when the Americans give top priority to containing Russia and even dividing Russian territory into hundreds of states, like because the United States have adopted a Nazi Germany strategy towards Russia, and both the United States and Nazi Germany have adopted Napoleon's approach to divide Russian territory, because Russia is not considered as a Western power or Western European power by the Europeans. It's considered as semi-Asiatic, and the Russians are considered as semi-Europeans. The history of conflict between Western Europe and Russia dates back to Alexander Nevsky's time back in the 13th century, when he was fighting Teutonic knights. This is something that is part of geopolitics. It's directly linked to geopolitics, and this justifies or explains why Russia is so keen to support Syria unconditionally. I believe that all these talks about a possible backstabbing of Syria by Russia is nonsense for me. We know each other since at least 10 years now, and you remember when I told you that the Russians will set foot in Syria. It's something destined, because it's related to geopolitics. And in spite of the good relations that might link some Russian officials to Israeli officials, and in spite of the fact that many Israelis have Russian origins or came from Russia or the Soviet Union, however, geopolitics puts both powers at odds, because, well, if we use a common sense in politics, which is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the friend of my enemy is my enemy, so this makes Israel an enemy of Russia, no matter what.
Dr. Jamal Wakim, it's really great chatting and discussing all these geopolitical issues with you, because you simplify you simplify to us in your words to understand global geopolitics. Unfortunately, in the era of social media, we are forced to deal with some so-called experts and pundits who try to preach and teach us what's going on in our region. So it's very important to bring you in Syrian analysis and give your insight as a voice from the Middle East. And I'm quite sure that soon we will meet in Lebanon, and I will record more videos with you face to face from Beirut. Thank you very much, Dr. Jamal.
It's always my pleasure. Thank you, Kevo.